There comes a moment, often arriving without announcement, when you begin to sense that something inside you has been waiting, not waiting in the ordinary sense, the way one waits for a train or a letter or the resolution of some specific situation, but waiting in a deeper register, the way an underground river continues moving beneath a house that has stood quietly above it for decades without ever knowing the water was there. You may have felt this sensation many times before, without naming it. It can appear in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while you are doing something practical and unremarkable. And suddenly the room grows slightly more transparent. The noise of the day softens, and you become aware that you are living a version of your life rather than the whole of it. The recognition does not arrive as an idea, it arrives as a quiet pressure behind the chest, a feeling of being faintly accompanied by something you have not yet met. You return to your tasks, you forget, and then, weeks or months later, the same pressure returns, slightly more insistent, slightly less willing to be put away. What is calling you in those moments is not a wish, not a regret, not an unlived fantasy of who you might have become if circumstances had been different. Fantasies are loud and theatrical. They imagine alternate timelines and dramatic departures and reinvented selves who walk away from everything and begin again somewhere clean. What I am describing is quieter than that, and far older. It is the part of you that was never allowed to enter the room. It is the temperament, the capacity, the instinct, the form of seeing, the kind of relating, the manner of being that was present in you from the beginning and was steadily filed away because it did not fit the shape that the people around you needed you to take. You did not refuse it. You did not bury it on purpose. You simply learned very early which parts of yourself produced warmth in others and which parts produced friction. And you organized your existence around the first category while quietly setting the second one aside. The setting aside was not dramatic. It happened in small daily moments, in microcorrection, in the way a child reads the temperature of a room and adjusts. By the time you were grown, the adjustments had become the personality, and the personality had become the life, and the life had begun to feel, in certain unguarded hours, like a coat that fit well but belonged to someone else. The role you learn to occupy in your family of origin is rarely chosen. It is assigned, often before language, through the unconscious psychological needs of the people who raised you. A family is not simply a collection of individuals living in shared space. A family is a small psychological system attempting to maintain its equilibrium, and every child born into that system is unconsciously recruited into a function. One child becomes the one who succeeds, carrying the unlived ambitions of a parent. Another becomes the one who soothes, absorbing the tension that the adults cannot metabolize. Another becomes the one who disturbs, holding the family's disowned anger so the others can appear calm. Another becomes the one who disappears, learning that the safest place is the place where no one looks. You did not negotiate your role. You were already inside it before you could speak. And the terrifying intimacy of this arrangement is that the role felt, for many years, like the truth of who you were, because love was distributed in proportion to how reliably you performed it. This is where the unconscious bargain begins, and it is worth slowing down here, because almost everything that follows in adult life rests on this single hidden contract. The bargain goes something like this. I will be the one who carries this particular weight, and in exchange I will be permitted to remain inside the warmth of belonging. I will be the responsible one, the gifted one, the agreeable one, the strong one, the funny one, the quiet one, the helpful one, whichever role the system needed, and in exchange I will not be cast out. The bargain is never spoken. No parent sits a child down and proposes it. The child senses it, the way a small animal senses the pattern of a forest, and adapts accordingly. The adaptation is intelligent. It is, in many cases, the most intelligent thing the child ever did, because it preserved the relationship that the child needed in order to survive psychologically. But what was intelligent at 5 becomes a prison at 35, because the bargain does not expire on its own. It continues to operate quietly beneath your adult life, shaping which relationships you enter, which jobs you accept, which forms of treatment you tolerate, and which versions of yourself you allow into the light. I observed long ago that the psyche treats early adaptation as a sacred contract. It does not easily release the strategies that once kept it safe, even when those strategies are now producing the very suffering that brought you to the threshold of reflection. This is why insight alone rarely changes anything in the beginning. You can understand intellectually that you were shaped by a role, that the role is no longer necessary, that you have the right to live differently, and still find yourself on a Tuesday evening automatically performing the old pattern with someone who does not even require it of you. The body remembers the bargain, the nervous system remembers the bargain, the instinct to be useful, to be agreeable, to be impressive, to be invisible, whichever it was, remembers the bargain. And so the work of becoming yourself is not the work of acquiring new information, it is the slower, more disorienting work of discovering again and again, in ordinary moments, that you are still operating inside a contract that no one in your present life has actually asked you to honor. Notice what happens at a family dinner. Even now, even after years of supposed psychological work, you walk into the room, and within minutes something ancient takes over. Your voice changes slightly. Your sentences shorten or lengthen depending on the role you held. You become more cheerful, or more guarded, or more apologetic, or more controlling, or more invisible, depending on the slot you were given. The transformation is so smooth that you do not notice it until later, perhaps on the drive home, when you realize you spent the entire evening as someone you have not been in years. This is not weakness. This is not regression. This is the unconscious doing exactly what it was trained to do, which is to keep you safely inside the system that once required this version of you. The family field is a hypnotic field. It does not need to threaten you. It simply needs to surround you, and the old self reappears almost intact, because that self was forged inside that exact configuration of voices and silences. Now consider how this same mechanism extends beyond the family of origin and quietly organizes the rest of your relational life. You did not stop being the one who carried the weight when you left home. You found people who needed someone to carry the weight. You did not stop being the one who soothed. You found people who needed soothing. You did not stop being the one who disappeared. You found people who preferred not to see you fully. The unconscious is not interested in novelty. It is interested in familiarity. It will reproduce the original psychological climate of your childhood in the people you choose, the workplaces you tolerate, the friendships you maintain, and the patterns of intimacy you mistake for love. This is what is sometimes called repetition compulsion, though the term is dry and clinical compared to the lived experience of it. The lived experience is that you keep finding yourself in the same emotional weather, with different faces in the foreground, and you begin to wonder whether the problem is the world or whether the problem is something inside you that keeps recognizing the same weather as home. It is here that the question of the unlived life begins to reveal itself in its actual form. The unlived life is not a different career you might have chosen, or a different city you might have moved to, or a different person you might have married. Those are surface variations. The unlived life is the version of you that existed before the bargain. It is the temperament that was present before you learned which parts of yourself produced warmth. It is the way of seeing, the way of feeling, the way of responding, the way of being moved that was edited out of your visible self in order to keep the system stable. And because it was edited out rather than destroyed, it has remained inside you, intact, dormant, occasionally stirring, occasionally pressing against the inside of your ordinary days. When you feel that quiet pressure behind the chest in the middle of an unremarkable afternoon, that is what is pressing, not a fantasy, not a regret. The part of you that never entered the room is asking whether you are ready, at last, to open the door. I have watched, over many years of clinical observation, the particular shape this pressure takes in different individuals. In some, it appears as a low and persistent restlessness that no amount of achievement can soothe. In others, it appears as a strange grief for a life that was technically successful but never quite felt like theirs. In others, it appears as exhaustion, the kind that does not respond to rest, because what is exhausted is not the body, but the self that has been impersonating itself for too long. In others, it appears as a sudden inability to continue performing the role that once came easily, as if the costume has finally become too heavy to wear. None of these are pathologies. They are signals. They are the psyche's way of indicating that the bargain has reached its natural expiration and that something inside you is no longer willing to participate in the arrangement that organized your earlier life. The signals are uncomfortable precisely because they are honest. The unconscious has begun to refuse what the conscious self has long accepted. What makes this passage difficult is that there is no clear external event to mark it. No one arrives to tell you that the role is finished. The people in your life often have a strong unconscious investment in your continuing to play it because their own equilibrium depends on yours remaining stable. The systems you belong to, whether familial, professional, or romantic, have organized themselves around the version of you that served them, and they will, often without any conscious malice, exert subtle pressure to keep that version intact. You may find that when you begin to act even slightly outside the old pattern, the people closest to you become confused, then concerned, then quietly resistant, then occasionally hostile. This is not because they do not love you. it is because the version of you they recognize is the version that has allowed the system to function, and any deviation from that version is experienced at an unconscious level as a threat to the system itself. The pressure to return to the role is often invisible, but it is constant, and it is one of the most underestimated forces in adult life. And yet, the call does not stop. The life you never lived is still calling you, and it is calling not because it is impatient or because it intends to punish you for the years of postponement, but because it is the deeper structure of who you actually are, and structures of that depth do not simply dissolve because they have been ignored. They wait. They wait the way the underground river waits beneath the house. They wait until something in the house begins to crack, or until the inhabitant grows still enough to hear the water moving beneath the floor. The crack and the stillness are not opposites. They are often the same event, experienced from two different angles. Something in your constructed life begins to give way, and in the silence that follows, you finally hear what has been there all along. To understand what is actually happening when the call begins to grow louder, you have to look more carefully at how love itself became entangled with adaptation in your early life. Because almost everyone who arrives at this threshold discovers, sooner or later, that the difficulty is not simply that they played a role. The difficulty is that the role and the love became indistinguishable, so that to step out of the role feels, in the body, like stepping out of love itself. This is the deeper mechanism beneath the apparent stuckness of so many intelligent adults. They can see the pattern, they can name the pattern, they can articulate the pattern with remarkable precision in conversation. And still, when the moment comes to act against the pattern, something inside them tightens with a fear that is older than any present circumstance, because the unconscious has not yet been convinced that love can survive the absence of performance. This conviction was formed before language, in countless small exchanges, in the subtle modulations of warmth and withdrawal that the child reads with extraordinary accuracy long before it understands what is being read. By the time the child becomes an adult, the conviction has solidified into something that feels less like a belief and more like a law of physics. Love arrives in response to certain behaviors. Love withdraws in response to others. The behaviors that produced love became the self. The behaviors that produced withdrawal became the shadow. This is where the question of the mother complex enters lived experience, not as a theoretical construct, but as a quiet organizing presence beneath the texture of ordinary days. The mother complex is not the mother, it is the internalized atmosphere that surrounded the early experience of being mothered, regardless of whether the mothering was generous or withholding, attuned or distracted, nourishing or depleting. Every adult carries a mother complex of some kind. Because every adult was once a small body entirely dependent on a larger body for survival, and that early dependency leaves a permanent psychological signature. What varies is the shape of the signature. In some, it manifests as an enduring sense that one must continually earn the right to be cared for. That care is never automatic, that one's needs are slightly inconvenient and must be presented in carefully modulated form. In others, it manifests as a quiet conviction that closeness requires self-erasure, that to be loved by another woman or by any maternal figure in adult life, one must become small, agreeable, undemanding, useful. In others, it appears as a chronic ambivalence toward intimacy itself, a movement of approach and withdrawal that the person cannot quite explain, in which the desire to be held collides with an older instinct to remain unreachable. These are not character flaws. They are the long shadows of an early relationship in which love and survival were inseparable, and in which the child made whatever adjustments were necessary to keep the channel of warmth open. The father complex operates with a different texture but with equal force, whereas the mother complex shapes the experience of being held. The father complex shapes the experience of being recognized. The father, in psychological terms, is the first representative of the world outside the original symbiosis, the first voice that confers or withholds standing, the first presence that signals whether one's emerging selfhood will be welcomed into the larger field of life or quietly diminished within it. When the father was present, attuned, and able to mirror back the child's developing personhood, the adult tends to move through the world with a certain unforced sense of legitimacy. When the father was absent, critical, intermittent, frightening, or simply preoccupied with his own unresolved life, the adult often carries a low and persistent uncertainty about whether they have the right to take up space, to assert a position, to occupy authority, to claim the work that is theirs to do. This uncertainty rarely announces itself directly. It appears as procrastination on the projects that matter most. It appears as a strange paralysis in the presence of older men or institutional figures. It appears as a tendency to over-explain, to seek permission, to defer to voices that do not actually possess greater clarity than your own. It appears, also, in its opposite form, as a defensive overcompensation, a constant proving, a refusal to rest, a relentless production of evidence that one is worthy of the recognition that was never given freely. I have written elsewhere that the parental images formed in early life become, over time, internal figures with a life of their own. They are no longer the actual mother or actual father. They are interior presences, constructed from the residue of countless small experiences, and they continue to speak inside you long after the original relationships have ended or transformed. This is why so many adults discover, with bewilderment, that they are still arguing with a parent who is now elderly, or distant, or even deceased. They are not arguing with the person, they are arguing with the internal figure, who continues to occupy a position of authority within their psyche that no actual human being should ever have held. The work of individuation, in part, is the slow and often painful work of separating the internal figures from the actual people, recognizing which voices inside you belong to whom, and gradually withdrawing the authority you once assigned to them. This cannot be done by an act of will. It can only be done by becoming sufficiently aware of the figures to begin distinguishing them from your own voice. And that distinction is hard won, because for most of your life the figures have been speaking as if they were you. Once you begin to perceive the internal figures, you begin also to perceive the mechanism of projection. And projection is one of the most consequential and least understood movements of the psyche. Projection is the means by which the unconscious continues to relate to material that consciousness has refused to acknowledge. Whatever you cannot bear to recognize inside yourself, the psyche, will arrange for you to encounter outside yourself in the form of another person, a situation, a recurring conflict, an authority figure who reproduces with uncanny precision the dynamics of your earliest relationships. You will find yourself drawn again and again into entanglements that feel oddly familiar, with people who provoke in you reactions disproportionate to the actual circumstances. The disproportion is the signal. When your response to a situation is significantly larger than the situation warrants, you are no longer responding to the situation. You are responding to something inside you that the situation has touched. The other person has become, temporarily, the screen on which an internal figure is being shown. This is the quiet engine beneath the repetition compulsion that so many adults notice in their lives without being able to name. You leave one relationship that was painful in a specific way, and within a year or two, you find yourself in another relationship that, beneath its surface differences, reproduces the same painful structure. You leave one workplace where you felt unseen, and you arrive at a new workplace where, after a brief honeymoon, you begin to feel unseen in precisely the same way. You distance yourself from one demanding family member, and you find yourself drawn into a friendship with someone who, within months, has begun to make demands of a strikingly similar shape. The unconscious is not punishing you. The unconscious is attempting, in its own unceasing way, to bring the unresolved material into a setting where it might finally be seen. It is offering you another chance, and another, and another, to recognize the pattern from inside the pattern. Because recognition from inside is the only kind of recognition that can produce genuine change. Consider the small scene of an ordinary phone call. A family member calls you, perhaps a parent, perhaps a sibling, perhaps someone whose voice has carried weight in your life for as long as you can remember. The call begins innocuously. There is news, or the absence of news, or some small complaint, or a request that on its surface is reasonable, and yet within minutes you notice that something in your body has changed. Your shoulders have drawn slightly upward, your breath has shortened, your voice has assumed a register that you do not use with anyone else, slightly higher or slightly flatter, or slightly more accommodating than your ordinary speech. By the time the call ends, you are subtly depleted, and the depletion is not proportional to what was discussed. What happened in that call is that the field of the original family system was reactivated. The role you held within that system was reanimated, and the bargain you made decades ago was quietly renewed, without a single explicit word. This happens not because you are weak, but because the unconscious responds to the field, and the field is older and more powerful than any decision you have made about who you intend to be. What makes this material so difficult to integrate is that the shadow attached to these patterns is not simply a collection of disowned negative traits. The shadow includes, often, the very capacities that would allow you to live differently. It includes the anger that would have allowed you to set a necessary limit. It includes the ambition that would have allowed you to pursue what was actually yours. It includes the discernment that would have allowed you to see through a relationship that did not serve your development. It includes the refusal that would have protected you from years of unnecessary self-erasure. These capacities were not destroyed. They were placed in shadow because the family system could not accommodate them. The angry child, the ambitious child, the discerning child, the refusing child. Each of these was, in different families, the child who became inconvenient, and the inconvenient child learned to fold those capacities away in order to remain inside the warmth. Now, in adulthood, those folded capacities live in shadow, and because they live in shadow, you encounter them only as foreign, as disturbing, as belonging to other people whom you alternately envy and disdain. This is one of the more painful recognitions of the work, and it usually arrives in stages. First, you notice that there is a certain kind of person you react to strongly, with a force that exceeds the situation. Perhaps you find yourself unusually irritated by people who are openly ambitious, or unusually contemptuous of people who set firm limits, or unusually disturbed by people who refuse to perform politeness, or unusually fascinated by people who seem to take up space without apology. The strength of the reaction is the clue. What disturbs you in them is what was forbidden in you. What fascinates you in them is what was exiled in you. The work is not to become like them. The work is to recognize that the capacity they display is not foreign to you. It is yours, sent into shadow long ago, and now standing on the other side of a wall, waiting to be recognized as part of the larger self you actually are. The false self that was built in the absence of these capacities is often remarkably functional. It can hold a job, maintain relationships, to perform competence, even achieve a great deal by external measures. This is one of the cruelties of the situation, because the false self's functionality is precisely what delays the reckoning. If the false self had collapsed early, the necessity of the deeper work would have become obvious, but because the false self can carry you for years, sometimes decades, you may arrive at midlife or later with a successful exterior life and a quiet interior sense that none of it has actually been yours. The success was real. The achievements were real. The relationships were real in their way. And yet the one who was living that life was a constructed self, organized around the original bargain, performing a role that was never freely chosen. The recognition of this, when it comes, is not exhilarating. It is sobering. It is sometimes grief-laden. It is the first honest meeting with the cost of the bargain, and that meeting cannot be hurried. What you begin to understand, slowly, is that the emotional labor you have performed across your life was not love, although it was sometimes mistaken for love by you and by the people who received it. Love does not require the continual abandonment of one's own center. Love does not require the chronic suppression of one's own perception. Love does not require that one becomes the emotional regulator for people who have refused to develop the capacity to regulate themselves. What you were doing, often with great skill, was a form of psychological caretaking that the family system, and later the relational systems that reproduced it, depended on for their stability. You were holding what others would not hold. You were absorbing what others would not absorb. You were translating, smoothing, anticipating, repairing, again and again, often without any explicit acknowledgement, because the acknowledgement would have made the arrangement visible, and the arrangement could only continue as long as it remained invisible. To begin to see this is to begin to grieve, because the love you believed you were giving and receiving was, in many cases, an exchange of services so deeply embedded in the relationship that neither side could see it for what it was. Once the exchange becomes visible, something inside the relational structure begins to shift. Even before you have decided to do anything differently, visibility itself is a kind of action. The moment you can see the arrangement clearly, you are no longer fully inside it, and the unconscious participation that allowed it to function smoothly begins to falter. You may notice, in this period, that you can no longer perform the old gestures with the same ease. The reassurance you used to offer reflexively now catches in your throat. The apology you used to issue automatically now refuses to leave your mouth. The cheerful tone you used to assume on entering a difficult room now feels unnatural, almost theatrical, as if you are watching yourself attempt a performance you have outgrown. This is not yet transformation. This is the in-between phase, the threshold, the period in which the old self has lost its automatic functioning, but the new self has not yet stabilized. It is one of the most disorienting passages a person can undergo, and it is also one of the most misunderstood, because from the outside, it can look like deterioration when it is in fact the beginning of an interior reorganization. During this threshold period, the people around you often experience your changes before you do, and their reactions are usually more revealing than anything they say in words. You may notice that someone who has known you for many years becomes subtly uneasy in your presence. The conversations that used to flow now contain small awkward silences. The dynamics that used to feel comfortable now feel slightly off, slightly uncalibrated, as if the rhythm between you has lost its old reliability. The other person often cannot name what has changed. They may sense only that you are somehow less available, less responsive, less reliably accommodating, and they may interpret this as coldness, distance, or even a kind of betrayal. What they are actually sensing is the withdrawal of the unconscious caretaking that has organized the relationship for as long as it has existed. The caretaking was so seamless that they never knew it was happening. They only know that something they depended on is no longer being given freely, and they often respond, without realizing it, with strategies designed to restore the old arrangement. Some become hurt, some become demanding, some become guilt-inducing, some become suddenly more loving, in a way that activates the old reflex of accommodation. Some withdraw, hoping that distance will produce the return of the old self. The strategies vary, but the underlying purpose is consistent. The system is attempting to recover its equilibrium, and you are the variable that has begun to move. It is essential, in this passage, to recognize that these reactions are rarely malicious. Most of the people who depend on the old version of you are not consciously aware of doing so. They experience you as you have always presented yourself, and they have built their own internal arrangements around that presentation. When you begin to change, their arrangements begin to wobble, and the wobble produces anxiety, and the anxiety produces behavior designed to stabilize what feels unstable. To understand this is not to excuse anything, it is to see clearly. The people around you are not your enemies. They are also inside a system, and the system is older and more powerful than any individual within it. What is being challenged when you begin to step out of your role is not simply the comfort of one or two people. It is the entire unconscious agreement that has held a constellation of relationships together, sometimes across generations. This is where the question of power begins to reveal itself in its actual psychological form, and it is worth slowing down here, because power in the depth sense is almost never what the surface mind imagines it to be. Power is not loudness. Power is not dominance. Power is not the capacity to impose your will on others. Power, in psychological terms, is the capacity to remain inside yourself when the field around you is attempting to reshape you. It is the capacity to feel another person's distress, anger, disappointment, or withdraw without immediately rearranging yourself to alleviate it. It is the capacity to hold your own perception when others are subtly insisting that your perception is incorrect. It is the capacity to remain related to someone without becoming absorbed by them. This kind of power is invisible. It does not announce itself, and yet it changes everything, because the moment you possess even a small measure of it, the unconscious dynamics that have organized your relational life can no longer operate in the old way. The shift is not dramatic in the way the surface mind expects. There is no scene, no confrontation, no climactic moment of declaration. Often the shift first appears in the smallest gestures. You receive a difficult message and you do not respond immediately. You sit with it. You let it remain unanswered for an hour, then a day. You notice the discomfort this produces in you, the old anxiety about being perceived as cold or unresponsive, and you let the discomfort be present without obeying it. When you finally respond, the response comes from a slightly different place inside you. It is shorter, perhaps it is calme, perhaps it does not contain the usual layer of preemptive reassurance. It does not include the apologetic softening that used to accompany everything you said. The other person feels the difference immediately, even if they cannot name it. And the relational field between you shifts by a small but significant degree. These small shifts, accumulated over months, are what actually constitute the change. The change is not a single act of liberation. It is 1,000 small refusals to perform the old gestures, each one slightly more honest than the last. Consider another scene, ordinary and easy to miss. You are at a gathering, perhaps a family event, perhaps a work function, perhaps a social occasion that you have attended many times before. The conversation turns, as it often does, to a subject on which you hold a clear perception that differs from the prevailing view in the room. In the old configuration, you would have softened your perception, qualified it, hedged it, or simply withheld it in order to preserve the comfort of the gathering. In the new configuration, something different happens. You speak, not loudly, not aggressively, not with any particular emphasis. You simply say what you actually see, in a voice that is recognizably your own, and you do not retract it when the room grows slightly quieter. You do not explain it. You do not apologize for it. You let it stand. The silence that follows is not hostile, although it may feel that way at first. It is the silence of a field that has registered the presence of something it did not expect and is briefly recalibrating. Within seconds, the conversation moves on, but something has shifted. You have, for a moment, occupied your own position without abandoning it under social pressure, and the unconscious has registered the occupation as data. The next such moment becomes slightly easier over time. The capacity to hold your own ground in ordinary social fields becomes a stable possession rather than a precarious achievement. But there is a phase before this stability arrives that is rarely described with sufficient honesty, and I want to speak to it directly because almost everyone who walks this path passes through it, and almost everyone is surprised by it. It is the empty phase. It is the period after the old self has lost its automatic functioning, but before the new self has assumed its full weight. In this phase, you may find that the relationships organized around the old you have begun to thin. But the relationships that will accompany the deeper you have not yet arrived. You may find that the activities that used to fill your time no longer produce the satisfaction they once provided, but new activities have not yet revealed themselves. You may find that the goals you used to pursue with energy now feel slightly hollow, while no replacement goals have presented themselves with clarity. You are, in this phase, between selves, and the space between selves is not romantic. It is not the noble emptiness of mystical literature. It is, more often, a kind of quiet flatness, a low-grade disorientation, a sense that you have stepped out of one life without yet stepping into another. Many people, encountering this phase, mistake it for failure. They assume that something has gone wrong, that the work has not produced the results they expected, that they have lost something without gaining anything in return. The interpretation is understandable, but it is incorrect. The empty phase is not failure. It is the necessary interval in which the old psychological structure dissolves enough to allow a new structure to take shape. You cannot build the new structure while the old one is still standing. The old structure has to lose its automaticity. Its scaffolding has to come down. And during the period when the scaffolding is gone but the new architecture has not yet been built, you are living inside a kind of psychological clearing, and the clearing feels in the body like loss, even though it is actually the precondition for everything that follows. The temptation in this phase is enormous. The temptation is to reach back and reconstruct the old self in some modified form, because the old self at least felt like something, and the present clearing feels like nothing. Almost everyone, at some point, takes a step back toward the old configuration. The step back is not catastrophic. It is part of the rhythm, but the work, slowly, is to remain in the clearing long enough for the new arrangement to begin to emerge of its own accord. What emerges, when it begins to emerge, does not look like what the surface mind imagined. The surface mind, in its earlier fantasies of liberation, often pictured a dramatic new life, a transformed personality, a sudden access to capacities that had previously been unavailable. What actually emerges is quieter and more interior. You notice that you can sit in a room with another person's distress without absorbing it. You notice that you can hear criticism without immediately reorganizing yourself around it. You notice that you can be misunderstood without urgently rushing to correct the misunderstanding. You notice that you can decline a request without producing an elaborate justification. You notice that you can hold a difficult thought without converting it into anxiety. These small interior capacities, accumulated over time, constitute the actual transformation. They are not visible from the outside. They do not produce admiration. They do not generate the kind of external validation that the old self used to seek. They simply make life livable in a way it was not livable before, because you are no longer being constantly drained by the maintenance of a self that was never quite yours. I have observed that in this phase, the dreams often begin to change. The dream world is one of the more reliable indicators of what is happening in the deeper layers of the psyche. And during the threshold period, the dreams often take on a particular character. Recurring dreams from earlier life may return, sometimes with new endings, as if the unconscious is revisiting old material that is finally ready to be processed. Figures from the original family system may appear, not as they were in waking memory, but in altered forms, sometimes diminished in stature, sometimes presented in unfamiliar settings, sometimes speaking in voices that do not match the original. New figures may appear that the dreamer does not recognize at first but feels strangely accompanied by. Houses appear, with rooms that were always present but never entered. Bodies of water appear, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent. Animals appear, often quiet, often watching. The dream life is not a coded message to be decoded. It is the unconscious continuing its work in its own language. And during the threshold phase, that work is unusually active because the structure of the self is in motion in a way it has not been since early life. What you may also begin to notice in this phase is the return of certain affects that were exiled long ago. There may be an unexpected access to anger that had been unavailable for decades. Anger that is not destructive but clarifying. Anger that finally names what was actually happening in situations you had previously interpreted as your own failure. There may be a return of grief, sometimes for losses you did not know you had sustained, sometimes for the years lived inside the bargain, sometimes for the parts of yourself that were folded away before they had a chance to develop. There may be a return of desire, in a form less driven and more grounded, less performative and more intrinsic. These returning affects are not symptoms. They are the slow re-inhabitation of capacities that were placed in shadow and are now beginning, cautiously, to come back into the lit room of consciousness. They are part of what was waiting beneath the house. They are part of what the underground river has been carrying all along. And so the call that began as a quiet pressure behind the chest in the middle of an ordinary afternoon has revealed itself to be something much larger than it first appeared. It is not a wish for a different life. It is the gradual return of a self that has been waiting, with great patience, for the conditions in which it might finally enter the room. The conditions are being assembled now, not by dramatic action, but by the slow withdrawal of the bargain, the slow exposure of the projections, the slow recovery of the capacities that were placed in shadow, the slow accumulation of small moments in which you remain inside yourself when the field around you is attempting to reshape you. The room is becoming habitable. The self is approaching the threshold. What happens next is the meeting that the whole arrangement of your life, conscious and unconscious, has been preparing for, often without your knowing. The meeting itself is quieter than anything you would have predicted. It does not arrive as revelation, although there are moments within it that have the texture of recognition. It does not arrive as transformation, although in retrospect a transformation has clearly taken place. It arrives more often as a kind of settling, one ordinary morning, or perhaps in the middle of an ordinary task. You notice that something inside you has stopped moving in the old way. The chronic low-grade negotiation that used to run beneath your every interaction has grown quieter. The internal monitoring system that used to track in real time how each of your words and gestures was being received by others has not exactly disappeared, but it has lost its urgency. You find yourself doing something simple, washing dishes, walking to the corner, reading an unimportant message, and you realize that you are present inside the action without simultaneously performing it for an internal audience. The doubling that used to accompany almost everything you did has begun to thin. There is just the action, and you doing it, and nothing else inserting itself between the two. This is what it means, in the actual texture of life, to begin to live from a place that is more your own. It is not that you have become a different person. It is that the person who was always there beneath the role has begun to occupy the foreground of daily experience. The role does not vanish. You can still play it. Briefly, when a situation genuinely requires it, but you can also step out of it. And the stepping out no longer feels like a betrayal of an unspoken contract. You have begun to understand in a way that goes beyond intellectual comprehension, that love does not require the abandonment of your center, that belonging does not require the suppression of your perception, that being known by another person does not require you to maintain a constructed self for their benefit. These understandings, once they have become embodied rather than merely thought, change the entire shape of how you move through relationships. You begin to distinguish with a precision that was previously unavailable to you between love and self-betrayal. The two had been so intertwined for so long that they often felt like a single substance. Now they begin to separate. You can feel in your body the difference between a relational gesture that arises from genuine care and one that arises from the old instinct of preemptive self-erasure. The first leaves you intact. The second depletes you in a particular way that you can now recognize before the depletion has fully taken hold. This recognition is not a guarantee that you will always choose the first over the second. The old pattern is deeply grooved, and it continues to assert itself, especially in moments of fatigue, stress, or sudden emotional pressure. But the recognition itself is a permanent acquisition. Once you have felt the distinction clearly, you cannot fully unfeel it, and over time the recognition becomes faster until it begins to arrive in the moment of the gesture itself, sometimes even slightly before the gesture, and you discover that you have a choice you did not previously possess. You begin also to distinguish between responsibility and emotional servitude, which is perhaps an even older confusion. Responsibility is the willingness to meet what is genuinely yours to meet, to do the work that is genuinely yours to do, to hold the obligations that you have genuinely undertaken. Emotional servitude is the chronic absorption of what does not belong to you, the carrying of feelings other people refuse to carry, the management of moods that are not yours to manage, the silent assumption that the comfort of others is your continuous duty. The two have often been presented to you since childhood as if they were the same thing. They are not the same thing. Responsibility leaves you intact and often deepens you. Emotional servitude erodes you over time, and the erosion is not noble. Although it has often been described to you as nobility, To distinguish between them is one of the great clarifications of adult psychological life, and once the distinction is established, the texture of your participation in every relationship begins to change. There is one more capacity that begins to consolidate in this phase, and it may be the most important. It is the capacity to stand without explanation. For most of your life, you have offered explanations almost reflexively, not because they were requested, but because the unconscious assumed that your presence required justification. You explained why you needed rest. You explained why you could not attend. You explained why you held a particular view. You explained why you were not available in the way you had previously been available. The explanations were not, in themselves, dishonest, but they were unnecessary, and the very act of offering them confirmed, beneath the words, that your existence in its current form required defense. As the deeper self begins to occupy the foreground, the reflexive offering of explanations begins to fall away. You discover, slowly, that you can simply decline without elaborating. You can hold a position without defending it. You can be absent without producing a narrative to account for the absence. You can be present without performing a justification for your presence. The silence that surrounds these unexplained acts is uncomfortable at first, because it is unfamiliar, but the discomfort gradually gives way to something more solid, the felt sense of being a person who exists by right rather than by permission. I have observed, over many years, that the people who reach this place do not become harder. There is a common fear, in the earlier phases of the work, that to step out of the old role will mean becoming cold, distant, indifferent, or cruel. This fear is usually unfounded. The compassion that emerges from a stabilized inner authority is, if anything, more durable and more accurate than the compassion that arose from the bargain. The earlier compassion was often compulsive, indiscriminate, and quietly depleting. The later compassion is chosen, calibrated, and replenishing rather than draining. You can extend care without losing yourself in the extension. You can witness another person's suffering without taking it into your own body as if it were yours to carry. You can love without merging. You can be close without dissolving. These distinctions, which sound abstract on the page, become, in lived experience, the foundation of a kind of relating that you may not have known was possible. The unlived life that was calling you has, now, ceased to be a separate thing standing outside your present existence. It has begun, quietly, to enter the existence you are already living. It does not require a dramatic departure. It does not require the abandonment of your circumstances. It does not require the construction of a different biography. It enters through the small openings you have made by stepping out of the role, by withdrawing the projections, by recovering the capacities that were placed in shadow, by holding your own position when the field around you attempted to reshape you. The unlived life turns out to have been less a life you might have lived elsewhere and more a depth of presence you had not yet learned to inhabit in the life you were already in. The same house, the same work, often many of the same people, but you, inside all of it, in a way you were not there before. This does not mean that nothing changes externally. Sometimes external changes do occur, and when they do, they tend to occur with a quality different from the changes the old self used to attempt. The old self, when it tried to change its life, often did so through force, through dramatic gestures, through the sudden disruption of arrangements that were no longer tolerable. The new self changes its life when change is required, through smaller and more accurate movements, a relationship that cannot accommodate the deeper you may. Over time, but the ending is rarely catastrophic because it has been preceded by a long, honest recognition of what the relationship actually was. A role that no longer fits may be set down, but the setting down is deliberate rather than convulsive. A direction that has run its course may be left behind, but the leaving is grounded rather than rebellious. The external changes, when they come, arise from interior clarity rather than from accumulated unconsciousness erupting into action. And the difference in quality is significant. What stabilizes, finally, is something I would not call enlightenment, because the word has been so corrupted by spiritual marketing that it now obscures more than it reveals. What stabilizes is psychological weight. You begin to possess a certain interior density that you did not previously possess. You are no longer easily moved by every passing field. You can enter difficult rooms without being absorbed by them. You can listen to strong opinions without being colonized by them. You can encounter your own old patterns when they reassert themselves, and you can recognize them as old patterns rather than as the truth of who you are. The weight is not heaviness, it is groundedness. It is the felt sense that there is a center inside you that holds, even when the surface is disturbed. This center is not an achievement of the will, it is the consequence of the long work, the accumulated effect of 1,000 small refusals and 1,000 small recognitions, slowly building into a structure that no longer depends on external confirmation for its existence. The self, in the deeper sense, has begun to return, not as a triumphant arrival, not as a mystical experience, not as a moment that you could photograph or describe to others, but as a quiet, ongoing presence that increasingly informs your decisions, your perceptions, your relationships, and your sense of what your life is actually about. The self is not a more impressive version of the personality. It is the deeper organizing center from which the personality was always supposed to draw its instructions, and which, for most of your life, was occluded by the demands of the role. The role was loud, and so the self was inaudible. As the role grows quieter, the self grows more audible, and the decisions of your life increasingly arise from a place that knows things the surface mind cannot fully articulate, but consistently trusts more than it used to trust the surface mind's anxious calculations. You may notice in this phase that the question of what you should do with your life, which used to torment you in earlier years, has begun to dissolve, not because you have answered it, but because it was the wrong question. The question assumed that there was a single correct life waiting somewhere outside your present circumstances, and that your task was to identify it and acquire it. The deeper recognition is that the question itself was a product of the role, an artifact of the bargain, a symptom of having been disconnected from the only source within you that could orient you As that source becomes more accessible, the question is replaced by a different relationship to your daily existence. You stop looking for the correct life and begin, instead, to live the life you are actually in with greater accuracy, more presence, and a more honest acknowledgement of what is yours to attend to and what is not. The accuracy itself becomes the answer. The presence itself becomes the destination. The honest acknowledgement itself becomes the practice that you had been searching for in countless external forms. And so, at the end of this long unfolding, what remains is not a new identity but a more truthful relationship to the one you have always been. The life you never lived was never elsewhere. It was the depth of presence and the integrity of perception that had been folded away in childhood so that you could remain inside the warmth of belonging. The folding made sense at the time. It was the intelligent adaptation of a small person to a system that required certain things in order to function. But the folding was never meant to be permanent, and the part of you that was folded has been waiting, with the patience that only deeper structures possess, for the conditions in which it could finally unfold. The conditions are present now. They have been present for some time. The unfolding is already underway. Even in the act of reading these words, because something inside you has recognized itself in what has been described, and recognition of this kind is not a passive event. It is the beginning of return. You will continue to encounter the old patterns. You will continue, in moments of fatigue or sudden pressure, to fall briefly back into the bargain. You will continue to find, with some regularity, that an old projection has reasserted itself, that an old fear has temporarily reorganized your perception, that an old voice has spoken inside you as if it were your own. This is not a failure of the work. This is the work, ongoing, deepening, continuing for as long as you continue to live. What changes is not that the old material disappears. What changes is your relationship to it. You see it sooner. You recognize it more accurately. You return to your center more quickly. The interval between losing yourself and finding yourself again grows shorter until it becomes brief enough that it ceases to dominate your life. You become, over time, a person who is no longer at the mercy of the unconscious arrangements of your earlier life, not because those arrangements have been abolished, but because you have established a relationship with them that no longer requires you to be governed by them. This is what it means to live from the deeper structure rather than from the bargain. This is what it means to occupy the room you were never allowed to enter. This is what it means to hear the call of the life you never lived, and to recognize, at last, that the call was never asking you to go somewhere. It was asking you to come home to a self that had been waiting beneath the floor of your constructed existence for the entire span of your life. The water is still moving, the house is still standing, but you, inside both of them, have begun, finally, to be present in a way that is unmistakably your own.